Before we begin, can I remind members and those public gallery turn off their mobile phones as they interfere with recording equipment. Before we commence the main business of today, I wish to turn to some housekeeping matters. Minutes proposed and agreed. Correspondence 219-497 proposed to note that correspondence from Minister Ross. Agreed. 219-498 correspondence from me to the committee regarding correspondence from Mr Terry Bryan regarding the master plan for Bunratty Folk Park. Is that agreed? Agreed. We forward it to the appropriate statutory body that deals with that. Correspondence 2019-499, Minister's Office, Mary Daly. Reappointment of Mr Michael Cawley as Chairman of Vulture Ireland. We've invited Mr Cawley to come in. He hasn't come in yet, so I propose when he comes in, we hear him. Is that okay? Correspondence 2019-500, email from Pádraig Ó Céidigh requesting a joint committee on the subject of drones in the autumn, and subsequent email suggesting named persons. I presume drones are not people that go on and on. You're talking about the ones that fly, yeah?
Absolutely. Just to clarify that, that's
okay.
it.
Okay, so we agreed, we scheduled that for the autumn. Correspondence 2019-501, email from the communications regarding insurance quotes for Irish citizens with a non-EU driving licence. Proposed to note that correspondence. Agreed. Correspondence 2019-502, email from Keane Spillane Sport Ireland, confirming that Sport Ireland will attend a joint committee on the 17th of July. Agreed. Correspondence 2019-503, email from Deputy Kevin O'Keefe, requesting that TII appeal before the joint committee regarding the delay of the name project. Deputy O'Keefe.
Thank you, Chair. I would urgently ask the TII to come before us before we go on a summer recess. As you're aware, Chair, the Dunkettle interchange development works in Cork are at a standstill with a number of months. Obviously, there's going to be a potential cost overrun. There is a cost overrun.
This is the Dunkettle roundabout.
Yes, yeah. Roundabout interchanges, and I think we should need to get the TII Transport Infrastructure Ireland in here before us to explain what's going on, because as you know, the budget has been formulated for 2020. And
I think we'll agree with that. So we ask the clerk to arrange that. The question is, obviously, the Dáil is in recess, but the committee will be sitting. It will be sitting next week, and to try and find an appropriate time for that.
They might be able to come in the same days afterwards. It might be only a brief discussion.
For next Wednesday.
If you can.
Okay, we'll request that.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. EU scrutiny. COM 2018-274 is proposed, does not warrant further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. Schedule B, COM 2018-254 and 256. Proposals listed warrant no further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. Now we're going to enter pre-legislative scrutiny. I just have a request to make with the consent of the committee and with our officials from the department. Senator Ó Céidigh, he has a prior appointment with a minister, which was pre-arranged, and he wishes to ask a question about this legislation. If you would take it, please. Now, if it's appropriate for you to respond immediately or alternatively later, whatever. But it's just to facilitate the question. Is that agreed with everybody? Agreed. Thank you. Okay. And Shanador, on Noel Rock, good Masha.
Very much, and thank you for facilitating me. I've a prior arranged meeting at 2 o'clock in the Department of Finance, so unfortunately I have to leave. I would very much like to have stayed because it's an area that I've, as you know, maybe a little bit of experience but a lot of interest in. So just in the context of this air navigation and transport bill, this is coming really from an EU policy directive or recommendation in relation to the model that's been used in many European states. So it's a European, let's call it directive, as it were, and a significant part of the purpose is that the Irish Aviation Authority have a dual mandate at the moment. They're both involved in commercial air traffic control services and have a significant income from that, and the state is benefiting very, very significantly as a result of that, and also they're a regulator, and sometimes it can be seen that there might be, although it's not in this case, but there can be seen that or perceived a potential kind of conflict or an overlap in some way or other. I overall welcome the bill. I think it's very good, and there was a lot of study done on this going back to 2017, where a national policy statement on the review of airport charges were were commissioned, and there was a lot of stakeholder involvement in it. So I'm aware of that background. The question really is primarily from an aviation perspective, and a number of airlines have been in touch with me in relation to the cost of the separation of this. How much would it be cost? There's figures bandied around there up to 80 million. And is it expected that the airlines, which eventually is the passenger, would be expected to pay this amount of money? So that's it.
If you're happy to answer now.
Sure, yeah. And we may come back to it, maybe other committee members, maybe. There are costs being thrown around the place. I'm not sure where the origin is of them, but we haven't finally put a bill, but they won't be anything close to that type of figure. All that we're doing essentially is redesignating existing functions between two organisations. So we currently have two organisations. When we finish this, we still will have two organisations, but the distribution of work and responsibilities will be different. And therefore, I suppose, whatever additional costs it might be, it will be round the margins in terms of back office administration, but it in no way will be material in the grand scheme of the charges that are put out there. We're working at the moment in terms of the charging mechanism, so it's a combination of fees that are put on Irish AOC holders, so Irish Airlines and pilots, but also then a huge amount of the fees derive from en route and terminal charges for our traffic control services that are regulated at a European level. And some of the monies associated with this should be recoupable through that process. And that spreads again, whatever relatively kind of marginal additional cost comes out will be spread across the board. So will there be cost increases? Not necessarily, but possibly. But over the medium term, we would expect the service levels and the separation of these functions, which we can come to in more detail, to result in much better services, a much clearer regulatory landscape, which in the long run is worth whatever small amount of extra money there is, charges will be. So I don't see it being of an order that will, notwithstanding that at least one of our airlines, every penny extra is a problem, but I don't think in the grand scheme of things it's a significant factor in this.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ronan.
The regulatory impact, did you do? Yes. Does it quantify any fund?
It doesn't quite. We did it at a point where we weren't clear about the costs, but I mean, I suppose what we're talking about with the IEA is a company with annual turnover of 200 million. We're talking about maybe a set-up cost in the order of 5 to 6 million in the transition, and then after that, relatively small. I mean, we're talking, it's about headcount, maybe an extra 10 HR staff, that type of thing. It's also something, part of our deliberations will be that there's quite an considerable cash reserve in the company by virtue of its performance over the last 7 or 8 years. And that's an amount that acts as a buffer maybe in terms of the transition.
Okay, your concern was that the industry might be paying.
Yeah, my concern was that the cost may be very expensive, and Ronan, I agree with you. I don't know the foundation of these figures, quite frankly, and thanks for clarifying that. And yeah, that the aviation industry might be caught with the significant cost. If it is a significant cost, it looks like it's going to be very marginal cost, and it's not going to be significant. And I appreciate that feedback. Just the one last thing in relation to it, and I raised this at a previous meeting in relation to this. In my sense, the Commission for Aviation Regulation, I think, are pretty well stretched at the moment, and they will need quite significant resources to take on this extra responsibility. And as you say, there is a transition period. It's not like switching on a light. So there will be a certain amount of an overlap from the Aviation Authority to the Commission, and also possibly a transition of staff, because the knowledge and skill set is there in relation to this already. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I know you've kind of raised this point in other sessions. You're right, CAR, which is the economic regulator and the smaller of the two parties, has 17, fewer than 20 staff at the moment, and our view is that it needs to, certainly on the consumer protection side, increase its capacity there. Part of the rationale for the merger into the bigger entity is that there will just be a bigger organisation, regulatory, just from an organisation perspective. And part of the cost issue that you've been talking about is some commentators mixing up the cost of the restructuring and also the cost of what you would be naturally doing anyway in terms of investing in consumer protection capacity, legal capacity and aviation safety and security capacity right across the board. Because the industry is growing, the regulator needs to grow with it, and therefore there's an element of some of the costs being assigned to that natural growth through this restructuring, and they're not the same thing. Yeah,
because in the region we have in the region of probably about 38 million passengers using Dublin, Cork and Shannon, I'd say 37, 38 million, 33 or so in Dublin, maybe 2.5 to 3 between Cork and Shannon, and so it's 37, 38 million passengers, and a staff of 17 or less than 20 looking after passenger rights. It's a big challenge. I'm not here to act on behalf of CAR. I've actually been on the other side of the fence, and I see the very good work that they're doing, particularly in relation to passengers and their fairness towards the airline industry as well. And I just hope, and I appreciate what you're saying, that they will get the resources that they badly need to look after passenger rights, but also in relation to this transition. And that is not going to be as significant as is bandied around out there. Okay, thank you, Chair.
I appreciate you have another meeting.
I do. Thank you so much.
Just you'll have the opportunity when the legislation comes before us to detail. I presume the Department will be able to, you'll have whatever update you have at that time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have to start now. I'd like to welcome to the meeting the officials and thank you for agreeing with that issue. Ronan Gallagher, Principal Officer, Dara Phelan, Administrative Officer, and Rona Tracy, Higher Executive Officer. You're very welcome. I'll just have to read the following, as you well know. By virtue of Section 1721 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter owing to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given. You are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charge against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charge against either a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I now will invite the officials to make their opening statement, please. So, thank you for your opening.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, the Minister has asked me to thank you and the committee members for setting aside the time to facilitate pre-legislative scrutiny of the general scheme for the Air Navigation and Transport Bill 2019. I might perhaps begin by explaining the policy background to this proposed legislation. In August 2015, the Minister published the National Aviation Policy, and included in that policy document was a commitment to restructure the regulatory functions of the Irish Aviation Authority and the Commission for Aviation Regulation to reflect developments at EU level and international best practice. The Government decided policy to reform the IAA was further reinforced following an independent review of the airport charges regulatory regime in Ireland, which took place during 2016 and 2017. That independent review led to the publication of the National Policy Statement on the Review of Airport Charges in September 2017, and it too included a commitment to reform the way aviation is regulated. I believe the committee has been provided with copies of both of these policy documents. Following on from these stated policy objectives, the Government approved a proposal in September 2017 to implement structural reforms of aviation regulation, involving a merger of the Safety Regulatory Division of the IAA with the Commission for Aviation Regulation, to form a stand-alone aviation regulator under the name of the Irish Aviation Authority. Government also agreed that the existing air traffic control side of the IAA would be reconstituted as a separate state-owned commercial company. In the period since, the Department has led a detailed due diligence process examining all of the issues related to this reform proposal, including staffing implications, financing and legal. And this work has informed the general scheme before us today. Coming to the rationale underpinning this policy objective. As it is currently structured, the IAA has a dual mandate. It provides commercial air traffic control services, whilst also regulating aviation safety and security, including the regulation and inspection of its commercial customers, the airlines, as well as its own air traffic control systems. The IAA's founding legislation dates from 1993, more than 25 years ago, and whilst there has been continuous independent audits of its regulatory performance over that period, which has shown the IEA to be a high-performing organisation by international benchmarks, the regulatory model provided for in the 1993 Act is, not unsurprisingly, somewhat out of date. The founding Act was about putting aviation regulation on a sound, independent footing, at a remove from the Minister and the Department. That was the right thing to do at the time, and it represented a significant step and undertaking. It has also worked insofar as it has allowed Ireland to develop a technical expertise that perhaps would not have been possible within a civil service department. However, much as there has been in other sectors, there have been major developments in aviation regulation practices, principles and norms since the early 1990s. And I think it is fair to say that our administrative arrangements have not kept suitably apace with these. The dual commercial regulatory mandate of the IAA, as it is currently structured, is largely an outlier in a European and international context, notwithstanding the company's high international reputation. The IAA's high performance as a regulator is an important point. More often than not, reform proposals come about as a result of a crisis event which points to a systemic failing, after the damage has been done, so to speak. In this instance, the Minister is reforming from a position of relative strength, and of course the question then is posed, why are you fixing something that is not broken? The Minister's response is that now that he has identified what the right thing to do is, now that he is clear that the current arrangements are suboptimal, then it is right to reform and put in place arrangements that are fit for purpose and match modern regulatory needs. In that context, it is very difficult to argue for no change, where you have a state body that has important non-commercial oversight functions and at the same time a commercial mandate to run a service on a for-profit basis. This leads it to have a regulatory oversight and enforcement relationship with the airlines and at the same time a commercial relationship as a provider to the airlines of air traffic control services. If we look across Europe, that model is now hard to find. And if we also consider the new EU regulation 2018/1139 for aviation safety, which requires Member States to ensure that the national competent authorities are independent when taking technical decisions on certification, oversight and enforcement, and exercise their tasks impartially and transparently and are organised, staffed and managed accordingly, then the case for reform of the current arrangements is all the more pressing. I would now like to take you briefly through the main provisions of the scheme. It is relatively straightforward. The scheme creates a new state-owned commercial air traffic control operator, largely based on the provisions of the 1993 Act, which will be reconstituted as the Irish Air Navigation Authority. This commercial function is therefore removed from the IAA. In addition, the scheme provides for the dissolution of the Commission for Aviation Regulation and the transfer of its functions to the IAA to form a new all-encompassing aviation regulator. The name of the Irish Aviation Authority will be retained by the new regulator. The regulatory provisions of that 1993 Act and the Aviation Regulation Act of 2001, which underpin the functions currently assigned to the Commission for Aviation Regulation and the IAA, will continue for the most part to apply to the functions of the newly formed regulator. There are some amendments to be provided for which I will touch on later. The general scheme is made up of 86 heads in 8 parts. Part 1 of the general scheme is the preliminary and general provisions. All of the heads in this part are replicated from the 1993 Act. These include the short title, definitions, application of the scheme to state aircraft, making of regulations, ministerial powers of direction, disposal of monies received by the Minister and expenses. These are all standard provisions. Part 2 of the scheme is broken into 3 sections. Section 1 is made up of 29 heads and deals with establishing the new Irish Air Navigation Authority. This company is to be established as a new commercial body under the Companies Act to provide air navigation services. The new company is to be set up on the same commercial basis as provided for in the IAA Act 93, using largely identical provisions. Also set out in this part are the objectives of the air navigation service provider, which are primarily to provide air navigation and communication services within the state, operate and manage terminal services, impose charges for its use of services, and give effect to the purposes of the Eurocontrol Convention and any other international agreements. This part also provides that the company will set out its articles of association with approval from the Minister and the consent from the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. Further set out is the issuing of shares to the Minister, transfer of lands, properties, rights and liabilities, and payments of dividends to the Exchequer. It is largely housekeeping provisions required when reallocating functions. There is also, of course, provisions around annual report of accounts and auditing, and again these are standard provisions based on those in the 93 Act. Staff members of the IEA whose work mainly relates to air navigation services will transfer to the new company, provided they are agreeable, and there will be close coordination with staff and their representative organisations. Section 2 is made up of 11 heads and relates to the dissolution of the Commission for Aviation Regulation. All of the functions of the CAR will transfer to the IEA. In addition, all of the staff of the CAR will transfer too, on the same terms and conditions as they currently have, and again working in tandem with the staff representative organisations as appropriate. Further provided for is the transfer of land and properties belonging to the CAR, along with all rights and liabilities. Section 3 consists of 8 separate heads setting out the new provisions, which will be made by way of amendments to the Irish Aviation Authority Act 93. There will be a new requirement placed on the IEA to publish a statement of strategy and other reports related to its functions, particularly around safety audits and inspections. The IEA will have the ability to recruit staff, but must submit a rolling 3-year workforce plan to the Minister on an annual basis. Powers will also be provided to the IEA to require the payment of fees for any application or renewal of certificates and licences, and any other functions which are set out in the schedule to the scheme to comply with EU and international law. The IEA will also have the power to make orders to give effect to EU regulations as necessary and appropriate. Part 3 of the scheme relates to fees and charges of the air navigation service provider. The service provider may make regulations requiring the payment of such fees and charges to the company, the Minister or Eurocontrol, depending on what the payment relates to. These fees and charges may be imposed on aircraft operators, aircraft owners, or upon the managers of airports used by such aircraft, and upon them all should the need arise. Again, all of these provisions are carried across from the 1993 Act. Part 4 of the Act is split into 2 sections and deals with the provisions in relation to Eurocontrol and the International Civil Aviation Organisation. These include membership fees, attendance at international meetings, the ability to take proceedings against a person to recover fees due to Eurocontrol, and the making of regulations requiring operators to keep records of aircraft movements. Part 5 of the scheme relates to enforcement issues. There are 9 heads in total in this part, 3 of which are entirely new provisions. It had been proposed to give the new Air Navigation Service powers relating to the appointment of authorised officers and the issuing of search warrants and the ability to bring proceedings. However, following consultation since publication, these provisions will be removed. That is agreed that only the regulator requires these powers. The head in relation to the indemnification of staff against any action arising in the exercise of their functions will remain. The 6 other provisions in this part are about joining up the current separate powers of CAR and the IAA. Part 6 provides for transitional arrangements. This means that all orders and regulations outlined in the 93 Act will continue in force while this legislation is being progressed through the enactment process. Any legal proceedings underway involving the Air Navigation Service provider will also continue as normal. It also sets out the transfer of land and property, rights and liabilities from the IEA to the new Irish Air Navigation Authority. Agreements are also included for transitional financial provisions around payment of staff, goods and services. Part 7 of the scheme relates to miscellaneous provisions. These include rates payable to the local authority by the new Air Navigation Service provider and annual performance statements from the IEA in relation to aviation safety regulation performance. There is also a requirement for the IEA to arrange for another civil aviation body to undertake a peer review of the performance of its regulatory functions. A further requirement is to appear before the Public Accounts Committee when requested in relation to its accounts and internal controls, and to any other Oireachtas committee as necessary in relation to its functions. The final part of the bill contains only 1 head, designating the IEA as the competent authority for EU regulations outlined in Schedule 1 of the scheme, some of which would have previously been the responsibility of CAR. In conclusion, the scheme may seem extensive on first look, but for the most part it is largely about reassigning existing functions and legal mandates set out in the 93 Act and the 2001 Aviation Regulation Act. Where appropriate, the general scheme also seeks to clarify and update references to functions related to EU legislation, which have been introduced since the original legislation. The merger of the IEA's safety and security regulatory functions with CAR's economic and consumer protection functions will create a one-stop shop for economic, safety and security aviation regulation in Ireland, and will ensure that Ireland's approach to aviation regulation is in line with international best practice. I am happy to take any questions the committee have in relation to the general scheme.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator O'Mahony.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and explanation and briefing on that. Just a very few quick observations. You mentioned that the new if you like, separation or whatever, or amalgamation, I suppose, that it will provide better services. Could you maybe give me an example? And I'll just run through the few questions.
Sure,
And maybe
yeah.
what you mean by better services. You also said about the costs, that some of the costs that have been, in reply to Senator O'Céidigh, would be marginal, and you don't know where some of these larger figures were got from, but I suppose in recent times we've seen costs of various things, various projects, you know, that the picture changed very quickly. I mean, are you saying is that this is definitely marginal costs, a few million or whatever? You also mentioned about the cash reserves, that it'll be able to be met out of the cash reserves of the IAA. What's the extent of those cash reserves? And then you mentioned, obviously, the need for this is because to update, and because it has been out of date, if you like, with modern developments. Maybe just to explain a little bit on that. And you mentioned the thing that it should allow the IAA to be proactive, am I interpreting that right, rather than reactive to crises that have emerged in the past, is it?
I suppose that point was more about the department's decision to kind of reform something that doesn't on the face of it look like it's failing. So it's more that we have an organisation that's functioning.
Yeah, more often than not, reform proposals come as a result of crisis event, which points to a systemic failing after the damage has been done. What kind of
so we tend just to look at regulators and regulation after the regulatory system has failed. And then we find a fix, whereas actually we're kind of getting ahead of...
well, that's what I'm saying. You're proactive rather than...
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's just maybe an example of something there? Sure. So I'll just leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Deputy Murphy.
Yeah, just not that many questions. I can see the logic in what's being proposed, and I take the point about doing it in a proactive rather than a reactive way. Just in relation to the designation of staff on page 11 of your opening statement. Oh no, it's not. It's page 10, I think. There's a 3-year workforce plan. It's going to be a rolling 3-year plan presented to the Minister on an annual basis. When you separate the commercial from the non-commercial, obviously then you're more dependent on the department to provide the resources. If those resources are not provided amply at the outset, it's very difficult then to scale up to what's needed. And I'd be quite concerned that the baseline is got right to begin with, and the full ambit of what is required is dealt with. So, I mean, the commercial side of it, I think, will, in many ways, that kind of takes care of itself from that point of view. But you've a loss of oversight by virtue of the fact that it is, or am I right on that? Is there a loss of oversight by virtue of the fact that some of that would have been formally audited by the Controller and Auditor General, or am I wrong on that? If it was, you might come back to me on that particular aspect. But we tend to think of the large airports like Dublin and Shannon and Cork, where in actual fact are not the only ones that would be subject to regulation. There's lots of smaller ones. I've one quite close to where I live. Western Aerodrome is obviously one of the ones that is, and it won't be the only one that would be subject to, say, the rules of the Irish Aviation Authority as it stands for separating things in the air. Yep. But in actual fact, from a planning point of view, what's the code is determined, I presume, will continue to be determined by the Irish Aviation Authority, because when you change the code, you can run into all sorts of other unintended consequences, like, you know, mapping risk and you know, and if you shift things around, it can impact one area to the advantage of one or to the disadvantage of the other. It's just some practical things that have been kind of evident that I've seen over the years. So you might just touch on those particular aspects about where those functions will be, and I presume they'll stay with the Irish Aviation Authority. The other aspect is we had a bill recently, or an act recently, the Dublin Airport Noise Act, and in actual fact the noise regulation was allocated to the Planning Authority, which many of us saw as wholly inappropriate, given that there was the very conflicts that you're trying to avoid by virtue of the separation here, where there's a commercial and there's a regulatory aspect, and it's logical and only right that you separate those. But that seems to me that we've kind of gone the other way in terms of noise regulation. Will there be a function for noise regulation with either of the two entities here? And I'm presuming if it's any, it'll be the Irish Aviation Authority. In relation to HR issues, one of the things that we've learned from mergers or entities that have been reassigned responsibilities, sometimes there can be, there can be staff on different grades and things like that. Are there HR issues that we should know about at this stage, and how are they being catered for? And would it be different between the two organisations? I presume the one that we've got most to concern ourselves with is the Irish Aviation Authority. And in terms of the kind of expertise, you might just take us through from the workforce point of view what expertise is available and what is required, because where there's a customer service aspect, and I completely get that, and that we need that to function properly, there is equally a complaints aspect that people might have with noise, low-flying planes, maybe breaches of rules at airports, where takeoff and landings might come from, might not be strictly policed. And will we see improvements from that point of view? The fees and charges that can be imposed on aircraft operators and aircraft owners upon the managers of the airports used by such aircraft, is that exclusively going to be from the what side is that going to take place from? I think they're the main ones. You've covered some of the things I had questions on. I think they're the main things I got questions on.
I just have a couple of questions then as well. It's just I welcome the benefits of the proposals to make sense. I just have not a concern, but just the clarity on the setup costs when it comes to the actual legislation. You'll give us the detail that you will have at that time. And the one question, as unfortunately politically haven't been involved in the setup of Irish Water and new entities and the trouble that they can cause for unfortunate politicians and administrators. Can I ask, when you talk about the transfer of staff at their existing professional salaries, and in other words, is there going to be any regulatory change to the work conditions, or are there any other additional or other changes that may or could be made? One of the problems about Irish Water when it was set up, it was supposed to be a separate entity, but they managed to benchmark it against another organisation in terms of salaries and things like that. So it's just if you can give us clarity on that.
Okay. I might just take them in turn then as they were asked, and if I miss out on something, you might pull me back on it. Senator, you're asking about what I meant by better services and maybe in examples of that. Part of in behind this, along with the kind of restructuring proposals, there's a digitalisation project going on at the moment in the IEA, and it's specifically around its safety and security side of the house. That already involves cars, so they've already preliminarily teamed up. And what they're looking at is for this new organisation that it will have a kind of a much customer-friendly system of applying for licence and certifications. At the moment, airlines, for instance, for aircraft, have to apply to the IEA for certain licence and certificates, and then separately to the car for different sets of licence and certificates. And then there's toing and froing between both organisations, and that adds a lot of time.
Streamline all of that.
It'll be one application into one organisation for a series of certificates and one point of contact, and then one certification or set of certifications issuing out. So that will be it. The digitalisation piece is just to speed up what is at the moment is a paper exercise, and also then, of course, the benefits that come from putting your information on once and it being held, and therefore it being tracked, and it provides for much better kind of engagement with the licence holders. Both the Chairman and Senator asked about preliminary costs, and I suppose what I said about earlier is that we haven't absolutely fixed, but we do have, I'm able to kind of comment with relative confidence around the margins, because obviously we have done some work around that. We haven't got it down to the finer detail. I mean, to understand them, what you will have is essentially most of the staff involved in the IEA. So you have around maybe just shy of 600 people in the IEA, sorry, just short of 700, 685 in the whole organisation. Of that, only 120 will be becoming part of the new regulator. So in other words, the vast majority are air traffic control staff who are located at the airports and located down in the facilities in Clare and won't move at all. So that will just be a nameplate change. So the only staff affected are those in headquarters in Daly Street. And within that, you're talking about essentially the corporate staff associated with the commercial entity. They are likely over time, but it can be managed to move out into their own headquarters, and the car staff are likely to move in, so there are costs associated with those moves, but the marginal piece is just around some loss of efficiency of not having everybody packed into the one building, and then there will be some additional HR costs, again probably not huge, and that's what we have when we have this debate yet what's appropriate, but we will, I suppose, to look at a high level, between the two organisations we're going to have around 710 staff and two organisations, and at the end of this we should have 710 staff and two organisations, just distributed differently. That on the face of it shouldn't give rise to a very significant cost base. On the cash reserves, it's reported in the annual report of the Irish Aviation Authority. It's in excess of 200 million, the cash reserves at the moment, of which the Exchequer received a dividend for last year of 18 million, which included an ordinary dividend and plus a special dividend of 12 on top of that, 18, yeah. And that has been the case for the previous 2 years, based on advice from New Era. But it's a cash amount because of the profitability of the IEA that has grown in the meantime, and therefore it's quite a substantial amount. And it's something that will be considered in the round as to what is the appropriate distribution of that in terms of assets and liabilities, but also then what's appropriate for these two new organisations to be set off with. What's an appropriate kind of cash reserve, and what's an excessive cash reserve, and what should we best do with it? But those are decisions beyond my pay grade and positions that we haven't come to yet. But I suppose in the background, though, it is at least we're again back to the point about we're pursuing a kind of reform agenda on organisations that are relatively robust in terms of performance and also financially robust as well, which makes a change probably from some of the previous efforts. In terms of what could go wrong, getting ahead of the curve, there's a couple of elements to that. There is actually, I suppose, a growing legal obligation in the EU. While it's not absolutely explicit, it's pretty clear that EU policy and EU laws are looking to have a separation of these powers. And if we look across the member states, 23 of the 27 member states have separated air navigation services from aviation regulatory oversight, which leaves 4, one being Ireland and the other 3 being Cyprus, Greece and France. So that kind of context is that we're an outlier. In terms of what could go wrong, I suppose it's difficult to speculate, but the issue is that we have, on the one hand, a substantive, financially robust and profitable commercial wing that represents most of the staff in the organisation, and then we have a smaller non-commercial regulatory function whose tasks include overseeing this strong commercial wing of that company. And while there isn't necessarily explicit problems, you can see over time where the pressure may come. And I think it's much better in the round to have a regulator that's absolutely separate in terms of its legal status and powers and management, to be able to call into, if it's needed to feel strong enough and in a robust enough position to call the service provider to account, which is perhaps more difficult within one organisation and the one chief executive and the one board. Deputy Murphy, you were asking about the staff and the workforce planning. I agree with you on the point about making sure we have a baseline to start and making sure that we have enough flexibilities, and we've been very conscious to build that in. So the workforce plan and this rolling piece is not being submitted to the Minister for approval, but more that it introduces at least a discipline that we don't have a regulator growing beyond what it needs to be. So the regulator will be fully financed from industry in various streams, and therefore it's cost-based. It will be accountable to the Oireachtas and also to the industry in terms of what it's proposing to charge. We certainly don't want to get the Minister of the Department into a place of second-guessing whether the IEA needs 2 extra civil aviation engineers or 3 extra security people. That is absolutely a matter for the company, and we don't envisage to micromanage like that. It's more to have the company set out clearly a 3-year plan and then report back to us annually to say it's working to that plan. And if there are changes in that plan, to be able to explain what those changes are. And it's not intended to be anything more than that. On the CNAG point, actually at the moment, the commercial, the IEA company isn't audited by the CNAG, it has its own auditors. And there's an AGM, and the Minister's represented there as a shareholder, and so that's the system that applies at the moment. What we will have after this is the IEA will fall into the CNAG space. So I suppose the suggestion is probably be more oversight, and the commercial entity will stay in that shareholder relationship piece. On the codes issue and the fees and the relationship with the customers, the regulator, I suppose the part of the rationale for taking the commercial entity out of the IEA and setting it up and leaving the IEA as the regulator was exactly that point, not to upset the existing licences and certs, and so there will be no change, and therefore it was to have as little an impact on the IEA's customers as possible. And we're relatively confident that the way we've structured it, that the industry shouldn't notice. Anyway, in any respect, the department does have a kind of an industry forum, and that has a regulatory working group. So we have been bringing our thought processes through that as well, and we will continue to do that just to sense check it against industry. That the customer is aware of what's happening too. On the noise point, we had the Dublin Airport Noise Act enacted in May, which made Fingal County Council the competent authority for aircraft noise. The history of that piece of legislation was that actually the original proposal was that the IEA would be the noise regulator, and it fell foul of the fact that it had a pretty significant commercial interest in increased aircraft activity at Dublin Airport, to the extent that the legal advice was that it was conflicted. And I know there was discussion in the chamber around conflicts or perceived conflicts involving Fingal, and that seemed to be arising from Fingal's role as a planning authority and as a rate collector. But the department's position, the minister's position, is that doesn't represent a conflict. That is just various different functions. from my own perspective, being involved in that and being involved in this, it's clear to me that the noise requirements are much more closely aligned with planning and environmental protection than they are with actually technicalities around aircraft movements, although that is part of it, and although the IEA will have to feed into that process. The most important skill set required of the noise regulator was the ability to run public consultation campaigns, understanding environmental directives, understand planning directives, and make sure that the airport is developed in a sustainable way, and understand how the noise mitigation measures fit in against that. And I would argue now that even into the future, where we have an independent non-commercial aviation regulator, that the competent authority for noise, as it's currently configured in the Act, is the appropriate destination. Now, that's, I suppose it's open to people to disagree, but we've thought long and hard about that, or strongly of that view. On the HR issues, there aren't as many differences in the pay comparisons as we actually might have thought coming into this. They're relatively closely aligned. What we have agreed with the staff representative bodies, and it's a standard undertaking, is that people will transfer on no less favourable terms and conditions. We are also mapping out, though, in tandem with the management in both organisations, what is the appropriate future structure of the regulator, including management levels and pay levels. And where they don't precisely match the transfer of staff over, staff will hold what they have in a personal capacity, and over time then you will go towards the optimum structure. But actually the gap is quite narrow, and it doesn't seem to be problematic. I suppose some of the nutty issues will be around just bringing clarity to people's pensions and the pension funds, and making sure that those entitlements already earned and those entitlements into the future are properly protected. But again, we've had good engagement with staff and management and the staff representative bodies, and there isn't, we haven't any formal agreement yet, but there isn't any sense of a wide chasm. So again, we'd be confident on that front. In terms of expertise available to the IEA, there's a couple of things here with CAR as well. Having this regulator will allow all the functions currently spread across the IEA and CAR. We see an opportunity for them to strengthen, particularly in consumer affairs, and strengthen in terms of how they deal with their client base. The IEA's staff are mostly aviation civil engineers, so inspectors able to understand and go out and inspect that the aircraft are sound, but also legal people and people familiar with the EU regulations in terms of work practices. So they check flight hours. They run this type of system as well. The piece about breaches of practices at airports or mismovements in aircraft, in the first instance, that will be a lot of that will be the air traffic control provider. So they're responsible for managing the planes in air and takeoff and landing. But I suppose running back to that, where there are, it will be the IEA's job to oversee that. So if there are incidents, the air traffic control provider will have to report those incidents to the regulator, and the regulator it's part of its role will be to come in and investigate whether that incident was properly dealt with, whether the systems were properly rolled out. And that's there at the moment, but again, it goes back to this idea that it's all under the one roof. And I would expect there to be maybe a more robust tension in that relationship into the future in a positive way. On the charging piece, in terms of who charges what, the air traffic control provider, most of its income comes from en route charges. So planes that don't ever land in Ireland, I'll just get the figures out here, of its 200 million revenue a year, 122 million is en route services. So that's transatlantic traffic. Terminal services, which are airports, Irish airports, the 3 airports, is 25 million, and then there's amounts of money separated elsewhere. So the safety regulator, the the residual regulatory function in terms of non-traffic control stuff, the fees are in the region of 22 million. So that's the amount of money charged in certificates to Irish Airlines and their aircraft, pilots, exams, a very small amount of that to aerodrome fees, like less than £500,000 in terms of licensing. And we are looking to introduce charges around aviation security. So, because we're investing in the IA's oversight capacity in that space. In other words, going out and checking that airports primarily have proper aviation security arrangements in place. I'm not sure if I've... Sorry, the Chairman, the set-up costs. We will, when we're back before the committee, again, sure, we will be much clearer. But they, as I spoke to, they're not huge. So it's really only just.
I'm happy that you'll give us the best knowledge you have at the time. Okay. That's fine. There's transparency in that. And the question about excuse me, benchmarking existing salaries. Yeah.
Well,
I raised that because it is an issue.
It is. Sure. We won't be. There isn't any pressure, and there's no expectation, and that's not part of what's happening. The remuneration packages available in the IAA are relatively competitive as it is.
Sure.
And CAR is a small regulator, and its staff are relatively high-level staff, just because of the nature of the business.
Of course.
So we will be watching for drift. We won't be having everyone drifting up to some higher level. It'll be what the organisations need. It doesn't look like it's going to be a feature, as it might have been a feature of others.
Will it be a standalone, separate entity?
The IEA will be, yes, and the reference point for its kind of salary bands will be existing regulators within the system, and it'll have to stay in line with that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I welcome Deputy Mark Sherry.
Thanks very much, Jim. I don't know whether the Committee of Selection has formalised my appointment yet, but I'm here anyway.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much. Is the cost of this 65 million? Is that?
No. We heard there was a figure of 80 million earlier as well. It's nothing in the order of that at all. I'm not really sure what the where that number is coming from. And I've heard 40, and I've heard 30, and I've heard different numbers, but I haven't heard anybody own the number.
I know I'm very new to this committee, but Deputy Murphy and I are on the Public Accounts Committee. I suppose that answer frightens me in that you've heard figures, but you don't. I mean, do you know how much it is? Like?
Oh no, sorry. I mean, they are figures being put out there that have no basis in fact.
All right. So what are the facts?
So the facts are that we will be starting off with two organisations of around 700 staff, and within that, moving around 150 between offices that we already have, and there will be costs associated with that movement, and there may be additional costs associated with getting additional office buildings. So, and there will be costs associated with recruiting in some additional staff around the HR for this new regulator.
But they're the kind of steps, they're the things you're going to need to do. So, is there department estimates on the costs?
Yeah, well, we haven't bottomed out yet. We've preliminary costs, and I suppose if I throw you a figure now and I'm back in 6 months throwing you a different figure, but I will say they'll be in the single-digit millions. And
well, some of those will not. You'll be at one with a lot of your colleague departments. There's a lot of moving feasts on the capital side at the moment. So.
Yes, and different thing.
Sure, of course.
No, because we can count the heads.
Just for the Oireachtas to take an authoritative view, it would be prudence demands that we know what the costs are.
I mean, when we're coming here to start the full legislative process,
so we're only at head stage at the moment.
The reason this is happening today is because the Minister asked for it to happen.
Which is very good, and I welcome it.
And just a point, just to accepting the accuracy of your questioning, I think earlier you did undertake to give us all that before we go into the legislative phase. Yeah. So there won't be any...
Oh, that's great. I'm sorry.
No, very important questions.
But there is a point I made earlier on. If we were to do nothing, both the IEA and CAR would have to invest in additional resources because the industry is growing and they'd have to match it. And that is the main cost driver, not the restructuring. So wherever costs are going to go up, they're going to go up in response to service demands of the industry, and therefore the unit cost of the organisations will not change, whereas the total cost will. That's the main cost driver, not the restructuring, because really all we're doing is, a bit like we do with government departments, move functions around to better align them with policy objectives.
The driver for this at the beginning, you did your own report kind of in the department. And in doing that report, was there substantial consultation with the industry, with airports, with the IA and everybody, or did you kind of
We did. There were
do
two
it
different,
independently and kind of, you know?
There are two different reports and a back history as well. So we have the National Aviation Policy, which was back with 2015. There was extensive consultation with that, and the National Aviation Policy is the document that set out we're going to do this restructuring. There had been two previous attempts to do this. Didn't, for various reasons of which I'm not familiar, didn't get to the point we're at here. And I understand there would have been some resistance within the organisation, as is natural, because change affects people and people are threatened by it, and therefore there is often kickback. So we had consultation in 2015, extensive consultation that resulted in the policy decision. We had another exercise to do with aviation charges, or airport charges, and as part of that, we reassessed our. I suppose we just looked again, because we hadn't made any progress. Does this still make sense? We were strongly of the view that did, and it came into that policy document. And after that, then we'd extensive engagement with the IEA and CAR about how we go about doing this. So over the course of the last 12 months, I suppose, before we've got to the point we're at today, we've had extensive high-level agreements with engagement with management and staff and the unions to bottom all this out, the policy idea to bottom it out, to make sure that it is sound before we come to the Oireachtas.
And is there broad support from all of the stakeholders?
There is, yeah. I mean, as far as I can. So we have a industry consultative forum, and I've been to that a number of times, explained where we're at and where we're progressing, and the feedback has been either neutral or positive. We have, I think it's fair to say, in the very early stages, at the senior management level in the IEA, there was concern because it's their company and what would the department be doing with it. But we've got over that. There would have been concern amongst the staff, which is natural as well when they first hear of that, but we've had good engagement with the staff directly, but also through their staff representative bodies, and they are on board and they're supportive of that as well. So I suppose like all things, when you first announce a policy, no matter how much consultation you do, once you've consolidated or crystallises that you're going to do something, people get worried. And we've been very careful to manage that over the last year.
Okay, so you're confident that you have that in hand. Was there a business case? Was there a business case completed for this proposal?
A business case, well, it's a policy. So
but was
the business case is around the fact that we have EU policy obligations in here, and then a broader regulatory consideration around the idea that we have a company that's regulating itself. I suppose one way to look at it, if it's helpful, is what we have with the IEA is the equivalent, essentially, of the Central Bank and the Bank of Ireland within the same organisation. And I don't think anyone would think it's a good idea to merge those. So we have an industry regulator and an industry service provider, a key market player in the one organisation, and therefore we're separating that out. We have had New Era run through the books, and we have preliminary financial information, and we will finalise that before we come with, during the course of the legislative process. But I suppose the decision making for us is around a regulatory policy piece.
Right. So there wasn't a business case, I suppose, is the short.
Well, I'm not quite sure what a business case. I'm not quite sure what in this context that would look like.
Yeah. Neither do I.
Yeah.
But I suppose it would be helpful. It's how we tend to approach things, when it comes to
there's
expenditure
there's a policy
or
analysis.
cost implications of things to say, look, is there a business case? I mean, there isn't, so that's fine.
Well, Deputy, to be fair, there isn't, because it doesn't lend itself to a business case. So there's policy analysis, there's extensive policy analysis.
Yeah, but there's cost implications of policy implementation, and just
as there always is,
in terms
yes.
of the cost-benefit analysis. Are Europe forcing us to do this, or because my understanding of the last, what do they call it, Section 32 safety audit by Helios Consultants, that they had said to keep the strong functional separation under review. It wasn't say do this, So look, I'm sure, and I'm taking out your word, this is a great idea or whatever. But let's look at the cost implications. Are we doing it? Are we going about it the right way? I have no doubt that it is a positive thing, but just to ensure that we're doing it the right way. The other thing is, has there been a regulatory impact assessment done?
There has been, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And is that a public document or?
It is. I think it's with yeah.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to get it from me now.
Right.
I can get it. That's good. That's available.
I think from that perspective, insofar as we're not changing the regulatory landscape, it's about how we organise it. It hasn't got a material impact on the industry.
Will there be any cross subsidy between the air navigation body and the proposed new IA?
There will be a financial relationship insofar as the Air Traffic Control Service will become a regulated entity and will have to pay licence fees to the regulator in the same way as other industry players will be.
And does that have to be approved by the Commission or anything?
It will be form part of a regulatory process that's ongoing at the Commission, yes, and that's a fee that air traffic control, separated air traffic control services pay to regulators right across Europe. So it's
and how much would that be per annum? Or
those figures have to be worked through. If I give you a cost at the top, a number of million.
Yeah. And who would ultimately pay?
For that one, if it's coming through the air traffic control, that will be a combination. That will mostly be distributed over the en route traffic that's going over our heads from across transatlantic flights. Yeah.
Well, will this lead to an increase to the industry of fees or regulatory charges?
Do you know, it depends. Not directly. Okay, so the challenge, and the point I wanted to make, your point is right about the business case insofar as we have to be very careful to manage the cost of this as we go along, and we will be, and we'll be accountable to this committee and to other committees we do. So we're mindful of that, absolutely. In terms of the cost to industry, I mentioned earlier in response to the question, there may be additional costs. They will be so marginal as to not be meaningful. But what I would say is that the main cost driver in the industry is actually from a policy decision and EU policy developments that require higher levels of regulatory oversight in safety and security. So if we were not doing this separation, we would be enhancing the level of safety and security oversight on Irish aviation. And that would mean we'd be recruiting more staff. And that would mean they would have to be paid for, and that would mean the airlines would have to pay more for safety inspections. But the department is happy that that's...
So at the moment we're the fourth safest
we're high performing
in the world.
Absolutely, yep.
And we want to be even safer, and we're going to pass on that cost to the industry for more inspections.
Yes.
Okay. So that's something that needs to be out there, in terms of those kind of costs, because I would say there'll be a queue from Aer Lingus to Ryanair and various other people into us, so it's important that we know, okay, yes, it is going to be X increase to you, but this is what you're getting for it. So there needs to be a payback, because there is a sense from the very basic research that I've done at this stage is there is pushback. So whoever the pushback is coming from clearly aren't in the consultative forum, because you said there was neutral or positive there, and that's just not what I'm getting, and I'm only a couple of days in this particular role. Is there a conflict of interest between safety and economic interests?
Okay, I'll come. Sorry, on the
potentially a safety issue,
I've been politic about
regulation. Law,
I'm being politic maybe about the pushback. There's pushback amongst some senior staff in the IAA. So, and some of the points you've made have been made to us. So that's fine, but I don't, I've listened to it, and I don't think there's anything to it other than leave us alone. I don't see any conflicts between economic regulation, which is the economic regulatory function is twofold. It's with the airport, Dublin Airport, and it's with the oversight, in a way, on behalf of Eurocontrol of the air traffic control. So the new IEA will oversee, inspect and challenge the cost base of the air traffic control. I suspect that might be at the source of some fears within the IEA that suddenly their cost base will be subject to maybe a level of scrutiny that it hasn't been up to this time, and I understand it and I'm sympathetic to it. But again, from a policy perspective, we're happy that that's one of the outcomes from this.
Okay, so just the chronology of what happens next, what's your, I mean, elections aside, obviously, what kind of time frames for the various?
Well, I suppose subject to the committees in pre-leg this process, then we will take, we will be engaged, the government's made its decision to draft this, so we will be engaging with the Office of the Attorney General and start the drafting process as quickly as they are able to facilitate that. It will be a priority for the Minister and the Department in the new term after the summer. And our ambition is to have a published bill in the autumn and start the process from there, and then it's a matter for the
All right, so theoretically we're looking at second stage and it all in October, subject to all subject to the variables, obviously, that none of us control. Okay. So would it be possible to put a little more flesh on the costs? You know, I said business case, you said, well, I can't see where it's coming from. I actually can see where it's coming from. There is a cost implications, it is, about how it's going to play out. And I think that would be useful for the committee members here in terms of us, from a standing start, obviously wanting to be advocates for something that's going to be positive, if in fact it is positive, but I just don't think we have all the tools at this point to be able to embrace that credibly.
I mean, I would expect us to have clarity. I mean, there is work going on in the companies to bottom out the costs. And the department is expecting, we've had some numbers, we haven't been satisfied that they are clear enough, precisely what you're talking about. I haven't seen a figure of 60 million, I mean, just nothing like that. I've heard that rumour put around.
No problem, but I mean, how long is a piece of string?
No, but if it was anything, if it was anything in that margin, I'd
what
wonder,
is it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even think.
And I think, as we've seen sadly from so many other examples, you know, we're better know this.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's
to be fair, that's a
then you've
number
been in
plucked
next
out of the
door
sky,
with Deputy Murphy and I and another committee beating you up over it in a few months' time. Chairman, I don't want to delay the meeting, but and I'm only getting to know the personnel responsible, but I do have a question to do with charges and things and everything. I mean, are you the right guys in the department?
Just before you get on to that,
sorry, Chairman.
Can you inform the committee, maybe update us as regards the costs that have been asked?
I mean, as soon as we have them and are satisfied with them, absolutely we'll share them.
So in other words, that will be in advance of second stage in the Dáil?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I expect that coming, any assurances that are needed in that space, but it'll feature, there's no way this bill is going anywhere with if there's any thought that it's, well, the department won't be sponsoring it, because I would be mystified as to where a cost that would come from reallocating existing functions.
Okay, thanks. Sorry,
it was
you
just
have another question, and I think Deputy Murphy, you have another one, then we'll wrap it up then.
Chairman, I'd be guided by you if this is out of order. I know they're in for a specific reason today, so let me throw the question out. Okay. And if you're not the competent people to answer it, and I shouldn't be asking it here, then just tell me, Chairman, because I don't want to be causing trouble. There's a proposal by the regulator to reduce the charge from, is it kind of 9.30 to 9.50 to 7.50. And I know theoretically it's very good because that's passed on to consumers at the end of the day. It'll, you know, we're all saving money or whatever. But there will be a concern about the potential impact of that on the ability of the DA to develop their substantial capital programme as a hub, which obviously there's various reports out there from Aer Lingus and various other people about all the positive economic outcomes this can bring to Ireland. So I just want to know if the regulator proceeds, and I accept the regulator is independent, proceeds with a reduction from say 9.50 to 7.50, where will the shortfall be made up for the DAA, and you know, does it strip out their potential to continue with their programme, which we're all in favour of, or will it affect their timelines, or are the department planning to fill the gap, if there is one, in terms of whatever isn't available through the charges, with direct subsidisation to facilitate the development of the hub, the 2 billion?
Sorry, just could I just maybe say that you don't have to answer that question
Sure.
because it wasn't on schedule, but if you wish to, you can.
It's fine, yeah. I suppose I'm limited, I'm conscious of the fact that that draft determination is now be subject to consultation. It's out there.
Sure,
so I don't want to say anything that might be interpreted as a departmental steer because it's an
Absolutely.
independent regulator. So I might speak in the abstract, really, although try to. I suppose so you have an independent regulator who's carried out a detailed amount of work, including an assessment of the capital investment plans of Dublin Airport, and has come to a draft position as to what it thinks that leads to in terms of a per passenger charge. It would be really surprising if the regulated entity accepted that first time out the gate. So therefore you have a regulated entity that's saying we need more and a regulator saying you need less, and that's kind of the way regulation needs to work. Between now and September, the airlines will have an opportunity to make their views known as to whether they think actually this is not enough to provide the type of services we need at Dublin Airport. DA will be able to make that view, and there's a process around that. The CAR's statutory requirement is to make sure that the airport has sufficient revenue and sufficient capital to invest and grow the airport. So there's no question of a regulatory determination being put in place that results in the airport making a loss or not being able to afford what it plans to do. There's no question of exchequer support. There's also, though, the way the system works is that it's subject to review, annual review. So if the regulator is undercut or overgone, the thing can be corrected when you see what happens. And I suppose our position is that let the independent regulator take that position and let the industry have a view, and we see where it goes, and they watch it over time. I mean, part of it is around, it's very difficult to be certain about capital plans, and you've mentioned this earlier, before they've even put a planning application in. So it's very difficult to even know how to assign a financial allocation over the next 5 years when a lot of these plans haven't even been submitted to the planning authority. So part of that is probably part of the tension around a disagreement as to when these projects might actually start result in the ground being turned.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Murphy, if you have a question.
Just a couple of quick questions. In relation to the industry consultant, was it one consultant, and who was that consultant that has been engaged to help with this process?
This the economic regulation?
You told us it was an industry consultant.
Yes, a consultation in the context of Dublin Airport, was it? Just what I said there.
Was there? What I mean, I picked it up that there was an industry consultant in terms of engaging with the various entities.
No, that was around the NAP, I think.
Was it to do with? Sorry, was it to do with the Deputy McSharry's question around? No,
it was to do with your response. I just picked it up and you said about an industry consultant.
I mentioned about industry consultation, which was kind of through the forum. In other words, it was that piece. There wasn't. No.
You had it directly. It was directly done by the department.
Yeah, absolutely. We meet them on a periodic basis.
And when you say the industry, who would?
It would be the Aer Lingus, Ryanair, the airports, the state airports, and the IAA. I think are the members, and the aviation regulator. Okay. So the main regulators and the main industry bodies. Yeah.
Just secondly, maybe my visual is wrong on this, but that the idea that you could have both the entities in the same building, is that how it will play out in the short term? Because it does seem that it's pretty difficult to go up the lift to floor 3 and somebody else is going to floor 4, and there's there's a kind of human engagement that doesn't create that kind of separation. Yeah. In fact, we often call it Chinese walls, and we come across routinely in the Public Accounts Committee where you have maybe the same consultancy firm doing this work for the same thing on two sides, which is on the face of it certainly looks like a conflict of interest. Yeah. So how do you avoid those conflicts in that environment?
I mean, that is something we've spent time thinking about. Even that we've been at that level of detail, walking around the buildings to see how we fix it, and that is something we're mindful of it. We are we know, for instance, when ESB and EirGrid split off, there was a period where they were in the same building, and some of the solutions was around security access and just different access doors. But like, you can't stop people meeting in the street and meeting in the canteen. So separate dressing rooms, yeah. So I suppose it's just to say, can we guarantee that we'll be able to move everybody out on day one? It seems a bit of a stretch, and it seems but it's ultimately will be,
okay.
and we just have to manage our way
And
through
when we
that.
talk about ultimately, are we talking about over several years? Are we talking about more kind of?
That is mostly within the gift of the commercial entity, because they're the ones moving, and it will fall on their ability to find a suitable space for themselves. They're looking, and as soon as they are ready to go, they'll be
It would
free to
strike
go.
me that it's not necessarily one that needs to be city centre either.
I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah. Just in relation to the digitisation project sounds like a sensible move, and from every perspective. Who sets the fees in terms of the licensing, and will that change?
We are, at the moment as well, there's an exercise being carried out jointly by CAR and the IEA around the future fee structure. That's due to be reported to us soon. In principle, we don't plan to change the fees as part of this, right? Either how they're arrived at or the rates. But it may be something that will happen once the new entity gets up. They set them themselves, but it's in relation to their cost base. So part of what we're trying to achieve through the legislation is to give them sufficient financial flexibility to grow and recruit as they need, but not to set charges at some imaginary number and to gouge the industry. So we probably have a bit more work with the legal drafters to crystallise getting that balance right. The IEA will set fees, but it will be accountable to industry, so it will be part of a consultative process, and ultimately it will be accountable to the committees in here and to the minister. So we're looking at what are the control mechanisms and what are other regulators do. But there are models there, and we look at the best one that fits.
And how do we compare in relation to, other countries in relation to charging? Is that modelled in, or? Yeah,
and this report hopefully it includes that as well. So hopefully a bit more clarity. I suppose there's two things I'd say on that. We're in line, but we don't want to get into the language of being competitive as a regulatory, right? So it shouldn't be that piece. It should be standards. There is a concern, I suppose, looking across Europe, that European airlines are able to register their planes in any member state. And what we need to avoid as a collective of member states is regulatory shopping, so racing each other to the bottom. So that's something we're mindful of as well, is to keep it consistent across the EU, keep the standards consistent. We have a common laws, but not let the airlines. So the airlines are entitled to push back, but not to the point where they're playing one regulator off the other. That's
right. And just a final question in relation to climate obligations, and I'm presuming the commercial entity factors that in any obligation, or is there an obligation, given that the transport is one of the areas, and I understand that from the Public Accounts Committee that we have a bigger kind of element to our transport requirements, because we have fairly large numbers of aircraft organisations domiciled here, and that brings with it the obligation comes with the location. Would either of these entities have an obligation in relation to contributing to, the, say, purchasing of credits or anything of that nature? How would that be? How is that factored in?
And this is not an area that I'm particularly expert in. It falls to a colleague. But what I could say is that this is subject. The airline industry and its climate change agenda is derived from European initiatives at Europe and indeed at the UN with ICAO. So there's an emissions trading programme at the moment, and there have to be offsets, and the airlines are obliged to do that. It's something we will consider, though, in the context of this bill, as to whether we can be specific on that. There are, under the Finnish presidency now, there will be a focus over the next 6 months on transport and climate change, and the focus is coming increasingly on the aviation side as well, albeit in proportion to other transport modes, it's not the biggest contributor, and there are huge advances in terms of aircraft design, but more importantly, there are navigation, space management, and what part of the technological investment in that area is to try and streamline the movement of planes, so reduce the journey times, reduce how much travelling they have to do, and manage them into different stratas of the upper
ones,
so
yeah.
higher up, less fuel burn, that type of stuff. So there's a lot going on. But we will consider what, in terms of directions, that these two organisations, what role they can play. I don't know off the top of my head how it's because it's buried in some of the directives and regulations, but we'll crystallise that as to whether we can do more in that space.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deputy, and thank you very much. The Joint Committee has now completed our scrutiny of the general scheme of the Air Navigation and Transport Bill 2019. Is it agreed that the general scheme of this bill warrants no further scrutiny? Agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. And the transcript of this meeting shall be deemed to be the report of the Joint Committee. The Joint Committee is now adjourned until next Wednesday, the 17th of July at 12 noon, I understand. Is that agreed?